Brought to you courtesy Ibis Premium Grade Flour. Introducing the new look of inspiration. Say hello to the all-new Ibis Baker's Flour, specially crafted for your finest creations and home baking moments. Now alongside your trusted Ibis all-purpose flour, both with a fresh new look. Plus, we're excited to introduce a brand new 5 kilogram size, more of the quality you love. Whether you're kneading, mixing or creating, do it with a brand that brings tradition to your table. Ibis, a tradition of excellence.
At Extra Foods, we care for you. That's why we always have the widest variety, the best prices, spacious aisles of total convenience, plus clean, safe surroundings. Let us care for you. Extra Foods, always extra for less.
Welcome to episode 4 of The Leaders Who Built Our Nation, a podcast series by the Trinidad Express newspapers. I'm Dominic Kalipersad. In this episode, we delve into the tumultuous 1990s, a decade marked by shifting power, rising expectations, and increasing political complexity. Today, we look at the return of Patrick Manning and the historic rise of Basdeo Panday, our nation's first Prime Minister from the bowels of the trade union movement.
His party won these elections with 20 seats to 16. In this term, Mr. Manning introduced the Government Assistance for Tertiary Education, or GATE, in 2004, and 190,000 people have benefited from it so far. In 2003, he opened the National Library complex on Abercrombie Street, saying the library was part of the capital's new city centre, already established by the Brian Lara Promenade and the City Gate. He added that phenomenal things are in line for Port of Spain. With the increase of constituencies from 36 to 41 for the general elections of November 5, 2007, a tie was no longer possible, and again the PNM won, this time with 26 seats. And as described by PNM Senator Foster Cummins in his tribute, Manning was a true comeback kid. Mr. Manning was again appointed the Prime Minister. This, however, proved to be arguably his most controversial term, when rising crime and some national projects drew public criticism. On April 9, 2010, he advised President George Maxwell Richards to dissolve Parliament, and the general elections was called 2 years sooner than constitutionally due on May 24, 2010. The PNM lost to the People's Partnership Coalition led by Mrs. Kamala Persad-Bissessar. Following the loss, Mr. Manning resigned as political leader of the PNM, but continued as Member of Parliament for the San Fernando East constituency, a seat he contested 10 times until his retirement in 2015.
Joining me is Dr. Marlene Attzs, an economist and lecturer at the UWI, who will help us navigate the political, economic, and institutional shifts of the era. Dr. Attzs, the 1991 general election brought the PNM back to power with Patrick Manning as its leader. He had served in the Chamber's cabinet, but now faced the challenge of uniting a fractured nation.
Yes.
What defined Mr. Manning's leadership in that first term?
Oh, great question, Dominic. Thank you for inviting me and for having me share some of our history in Trinidad and Tobago. But I think before I delve into the actual response on Patrick Manning, I think it's useful for us to understand the context, the economic and social context that preceded his ascent to the office of Prime Minister. So we know of the 1990 events under the NAR led by then Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson. So the country was still trying to get over that event that really brought to the fore all of the fractures in our society, all of the social unrest that was bubbling, because during the period 1986 to 1991, when Mr. Robinson headed the government as the Prime Minister, we saw structural adjustment. There were high levels of unemployment. He actually devalued the currency during his term. And while, as an economist, you may have heard me say that economically speaking, a devaluation is sometimes necessary, but with it comes, severe price increases and increases in the cost of living. So I think all of those would have combined to create that pressure that the society and the economy was feeling. Plus, we were also kind of still trying to grapple with the structural adjustment programs that had come before. So all of those led to the pressure valve that resulted in the 1990 coup, and I'll describe it as a pressure valve. So enter Mr. Manning in that period, having to try to pull together all of these fractured segments of our country and still manage the economy. And he came in at a time where the world would have realized that the oil sector, Trinidad and Tobago's sector, oil economy, as it were, was now a mature economy, was maturing at that time. So he had to contend with the fact that he was not earning as much revenue. He was trying to mend social fences, so to speak. So it was really walking a tightrope at that time. But to his credit, Mr. Manning came in with a vision. He felt that we needed to shift the conversation, strategically shift the conversation away from an oil-based economy into a gas-based economy. So I think it's one of the things that he could be credited for that visionary leadership that saw us shifting, as it were, into a gas-based economy and trying to engage and trying to capitalize on engaging international companies to come and invest in the gas sector in Trinidad and Tobago. So essentially wooing and phoning international investors, trying to rebuild the economy, as it were, and also at the same time try to repair, some of the social fallout that would have happened during the previous administration.
And why do you think governments like the Patrick Manning government and subsequent governments didn't seem to diversify the economy sufficiently, the agricultural sector, tourism sector, whatever?
Because oil and gas has always been king. And once we had enough money coming in from the energy sector, we could buy whatever we wanted. We could import whatever we wanted. So I think there was a very tunnel vision, what we tend to call in economics the Dutch disease or the resource curse, meaning that you're so heavily focused on this goose that is laying the golden egg that you forget that the other chickens need to kind of have some attention. And
but one might say that the governments have capitalized on accidental benefits. Like it wasn't through their action that the economy blossomed.
Absolutely. The exogenous factors. So the price of oil and gas, we're nowhere in that game in terms of determining the price. We simply are beneficiaries based on whatever exogenous factors are taking place in the rest of the world. And yes, hindsight is everything. And I think our leaders, because we have always been able to get some manna from heaven, so to speak, even when things became very difficult, there would always be some international event, whether it's a war in, the Middle East or some policy taken by another government that would redound to our benefit. And I think that clouded our vision because we were always in a position where we had the amount of money that we needed to do what needed to be done. So Prime Minister Manning would have focused on infrastructure projects. He would have been credited with having the foresight to look at the Atlantic LNG and to lay that foundation, so to speak, to lay the foundation for infrastructure development. So he used whatever money that he earned from the energy sector to invest more. But he also was credited with looking at downstream industries, so downstream petrochemicals, and getting foreigners to come and invest in things like our ammonia plants and all of these things. So his vision, while it was still focused on the energy sector, looked at gas and looked at more of the downstream industries. So credit to him for that. And it came to pass that we actually did benefit a lot from that vision.
Organizationally in the PNM, it was clear that the PNM was no longer attractive to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. There are those among us who have the view that the population was ungrateful. I am not of that view at all. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, there are those among us who also feel that the PNM's loss of power in 1986 was a blessing in disguise. I fail to see the disguise. I am prepared to say that it was a blessing because, in fact, now that we are coming back reorganized, revitalized, and in a much better position to discharge our responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
We've not done a very good job, I think, of communicating the linkages between economic growth and the prosperity for people and how they're meant to benefit from that. So while the politicians and the technocrats might focus on the economic growth factor and growing the economy as a whole and getting us out of that structural adjustment era, the population really wants to know, well, what's in this for me? And if the population doesn't feel as if they are benefiting from whatever the politicians might be doing, we do what we do best. We let you know about our displeasure at the polls, and that is what happened.
What do you think may have been the impact psychologically, sociologically, politically for a prime minister like Patrick Manning coming into power under the shadow of the legacy of Dr. Eric Williams, even Chambers after him?
Yes.
And now he has to step into the shoes.
The advantage he had is that they were all from the same party. So it's not as if, he would have, I imagine, been schooled by them and mentored by them or would have learned something from having, Eric Williams, those were tremendous shoes because he would have brought us out of independence and would have essentially framed or crafted a vision for this new country, Trinidad and Tobago, independent, how we would use our oil revenues to stimulate not just the economy, but to focus on education and creating the society that we call Trinidad and Tobago. So it would have been some tremendous shoes for Patrick Manning, but I think he would have been, as I said, because they were all from the same party and I imagine they share the same philosophy, at that time, it probably was essentially succession planning that he would have expected at some point in time that he would have assumed leadership of the country and simply continue the mandate that was set before.
How do you think the justice system and governance evolved during the Manning period?
Coming out of the previous period, the 1986 to 1991, there were some concerns, I think, around the fractured governance and institutional arrangements, which, to my mind, was one of the reasons that the 1990 events occurred. And coming in 1991, I think Prime Minister Manning would have tried his best to repair some of those fractures in the governance and institutional arrangements, but I think he was not as successful as the population would have liked him to be, or he didn't respond in the way that the population would have liked him to respond. And one of the things that also I think would have led to him losing at the polls would have been the fact that the country felt that the governance arrangements and the institutional arrangements were still fractured and, there was not sufficient transparency, etc., coming out of the government. And they would have responded again at the polls as they felt. So again, while his focus was on the economy and ensuring that the economy stabilized, and perhaps at some point in time he would get to some of these other issues, the social issues, the governance issues, the institutional arrangements, the country was not as patient. So I think the country felt that things were not going well under the Patrick Manning administration and they signaled their discontent.
The country may have also started to lose trust in him.
I suspect as much. I suspect as well that I think that would have been the factor that, losing trust.
When we return, the emergence of a new leader changes the course of our political history.
Introducing the new look of inspiration. Say hello to the all-new Ibis Baker's flour, specially crafted for your finest creations and home baking moments. Now alongside your trusted Ibis all-purpose flour, both with a fresh new look. Plus, we're excited to introduce a brand new 5 kilogram size, more of the quality you love. Whether you're kneading, mixing or creating, do it with a brand that brings tradition to your table. Ibis, a tradition of excellence.
At Extra Foods, we care for you. That's why we always have the widest variety, the best prices, spacious aisles of total convenience, plus clean, safe surroundings. Let us care for you. Extra Foods, always extra for less.
The race factor always seemed to emerge perhaps only at election time.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that.
Why do you think governments like Patrick Manning's didn't seem to address that issue of racial harmony, racial unity?
Again, and this is my own view, because the People's National Movement has, even though we've had significant players in the People's National Movement who were Indo-Trinidadians, Kamaluddin Mohammed, Winston Mahabir, all of these persons, there is a feeling that the People's National Movement is an Afro-Trinidadian party. And I think perhaps they were too timid to try to break that notion that it's an Afro-Trinidadian party. So they came in and they did not address the elephant in the room, which is the racial tension. But then you had other governments, like Basdeo Panday, who I think focused on the fact that Trinidad and Tobago, we have to focus on the fact that we have two dominant ethnic groups, but harmony is what pulls us together. And I think that was one of the memorable things about a leader such as Basdeo Panday.
So let's talk about Basdeo Panday. In 1995, Patrick Manning called a snap election.
Yes.
It ended with the UNC forming a coalition government.
Absolutely.
Basdeo Panday was sworn in as Prime Minister, breaking that 33-year pattern of Afro-Trinidadian leadership.
Yes.
What did Panday's election mean to the national psyche?
I think it was a collective, somewhere between a sigh and a gasp, because we had to deal with the fact that here was a prime minister of Indo-Trinidadian descent, but from the bowels of the trade union movement, as you indicated in your introductory comments. So the thinking was, he knew about the man on the ground. He could relate to what was happening to the man on the ground. He could relate to what workers felt. And I think the country was looking forward to that different vision, that charisma that Mr. Panday brought. And I think the country welcomed it, because he was now seen as one of us, in that sense that he was a worker. He came from the trade union movement. So he understood the needs and the priorities of workers. But he had this challenge of managing a coalition government. He was very skillful. And I reflect when Mr. Panday passed away, and you saw the outpouring of love and support from throughout the country. And I think that was reflective of the kind of leader that people saw him as. Perhaps not when he was the sitting prime minister, but I think certainly thereafter, comparing him with some of his predecessors and some of his successors, I think the population embraced him as he was really a man of the people.
The Prime Minister was also greeted by senior staff officials and then quickly whisked away to say hello to staffers on the upper 3 floors of the building. While the reception was warm and welcoming in many of the departments, 1 or 2 employees were not as welcoming. In fact, their courtesies were somewhat lukewarm. Nevertheless, Mr. Panday remained optimistic.
A very pleasant experience indeed, and I could feel the goodwill and the sense of warmth among the staff. I have assured them that I'll operate an open door policy here.
The Prime Minister says he wants to have Parliament reconvened by November 22nd. However, cabinet appointments, he promises, won't take place before full consultation.
As you know, what I want to do is I want to have the widest consultation before I appoint the ministers and cabinet, and even the senators. So that's why I'm going to speak to the business community, I want to speak to the labor movement and so on.
One of the things that I would want to credit Prime Minister Panday for is that he wanted to focus on development. So while I would have said that Prime Minister Manning focused on the economy and trying to revive the economy and get economic growth and stabilization taking place, Prime Minister Panday focused on development, on people, and wanting to ensure that the population, that the citizens felt that the economy was working in their favor.
Do you think he succeeded in having the people feel that he was a prime minister working for the development of the people?
Yes, I think he succeeded, but unfortunately, because of, the internal dynamics of his coalition, and of course he fell out with the trade union movement, and that would not have resonated well with workers and with, the population in the country. And, so that fractured relationship in the coalition then spilled over into the population, and population were wondering, well, hang on here, is he really kind of doing what is in the best interest of the population, or is he simply another leader who is focusing on himself? And allegations of cronyism and, bias taking place in the government, against, different sectors of the economy and segments of the population. I think all of these things would have come back to haunt Prime Minister Panday. So while he was a Prime Minister of the people, and, he had that connection. So whereas persons might have seen Prime Minister Manning as not quite connected with the people, Prime Minister Panday was in panyards and connecting with people and, doing all of these things that people like. People like to be able to relate to their leaders. But the factions and the fractures with the trade union movement would have left some concern. And then the allegations of, goings on and cronyism and nepotism and all of these things that would have haunted his term in office. I think that ultimately kind of spilled over and the population started to get a little concerned.
So Trinidad and Tobago has had a history of trade union involvement in the politics from the early days.
Absolutely.
But there seems to be, especially in the recent era, sort of marriage of convenience with the trade union movement. It didn't work with Basdeo Panday. We don't know what's happening now. Was that a smart move by Basdeo Panday?
In terms of the coalition, I think it was what politically was needed at the time, because remember, you're coming out of this would have been the first significant break from Afro-Trinidadian rule, because even the PNM and then you had the NAR was Afro-Trinidadian, and now you had this Indo-Trinidadian Prime Minister who, through his coalition and his relationship with the unions, was now trying to bring everyone together. So whether it was a smart move or not...
Well, was the coalition a situation of two-man rat in one hole?
Always is the situation. I think it's always, and even now, we can see that, some of those things surfacing and will continue to surface over time. But at that moment, I think Mr. Panday and his collaborators, for want of a better description, would have thought this is what the country needed. We needed to pull the country together. And if it required a marriage of convenience and two-man rat deciding that we're going to try to live in the same space and coexist, I think that is what was required at the time. And they went for it, and credit to them.
With United Sugar Workers under his stewardship, Panday led the fight for guaranteed work.
And the sugar workers were poor because not only were their wages low, but they only worked for half the year. This problem was not merely a problem of wages, it was a problem of work. So we decided that the first thing to do was to fight for guaranteed work. That is to say, you can't work us for 6 months of the year and discard us for another 6. We demand that you employ us during the wet season.
Mr. Panday understood that people had to eat, people had to live, and he could not have sustained any prolonged period of strike because he felt that the workers would break.
Now, as you said, Panday's term was marked with efforts to modernize infrastructure and improve education. Yet, corruption allegations
That's correct.
And party fractures clouded his tenure.
Yes, and it relates to one of the questions you asked about governance under the Patrick Manning administration. And here was the country again living through these scandals and these questions about corruption and poor procurement, which wasn't the term that was used then, but, friends with benefits and friends getting benefits and I think the noise grew significantly in the country, and again, that led to the demise of the party, of that particular government. The country just felt that, we're not going to go through this again, the airport scandal and all of these things. We're not going to live through these kinds of scandals again, essentially asking, where the money gone? Because again, there is often a separation between what is happening politically in the country, what is happening economically in the country, and the people on the ground. So press conferences, information about what was happening. People don't pay attention to budget speeches, for example, except to find out if their favorite food or drink or whatever it is going to become more expensive. So the connections between the politics of the day, what was happening in the economy, and how it was impacting on the population was not very clear. So the population only responded to what they heard, and what they felt was corruption, was cronyism, and the allegations. And I have to say that it's an important role that the media plays in terms of bridging that gap, and should continue to play that role. So if the headlines are reporting allegations of corruption, and those are what are occupying the public spaces, it is ultimately going to occupy the minds of the population, and that is going to become, the deciding factor when an electorate goes to the polls.
Panday's term was marked by efforts to modernize infrastructure and improve education. Yet corruption allegations and party fractures clouded his tenure.
Introducing the new look of inspiration. Say hello to the all-new Ibis Baker's flour, specially crafted for your finest creations and home baking moments. Now alongside your trusted Ibis all-purpose flour, both with a fresh new look. Plus, we're excited to introduce a brand new 5 kilogram size, more of the quality you love. Whether you're kneading, mixing, or creating, do it with a brand that brings tradition to your table. Ibis, a tradition of excellence.
At Extra Foods, we care for you. That's why we always have the widest variety, the best prices, spacious aisles of total convenience, plus clean, safe surroundings. Let us care for you. Extra Foods, always extra for less.
So the 1990s gave us leadership that broke barriers, revived old loyalties, and raised new constitutional questions. It was a decade that laid the groundwork for many of the tensions and possibilities we face today. What would you say would have been Mr. Panday's 3 greatest achievements?
One, that he actually was the first prime minister to bring the trade unionism into the bowels of government, so to speak, and bridge that gap, because traditionally there has been a contentious relationship between labor and government. So I think that was significant, however short-lived it was. I think it was significant. 2, I think he focused on a people-centered approach to development. So while he recognized the importance of the economy, his focus was on people and ensuring that all of the architecture to support people-centered development was put in place, which relates to the third major or significant thing: infrastructure, education, putting in place social services, that social development pillar that helps support the population. I think for me, those would be the 3 main things that I would remember, that I would credit Mr. Panday for. And of course, he would have also seen, I think, the final completion of the Atlantic LNG. So he would have continued because he recognized that it was significant for the economic health of Trinidad and Tobago. So I think he would have been the leader to ensure that the final investment decision for the Atlantic plant was realized. And, we have today that legacy of Atlantic LNG.
Now, you mentioned the issue of constitutional reform,
Yes.
which is something that Basdeo Panday has espoused
Yes.
repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
Why has it never happened?
My view is that the country doesn't know, it knows so little about our constitution that it doesn't matter to them. And while politicians may espouse constitutional reform because it appeals to certain segments of the population at large neither knows nor cares about the constitution. And I've realized this within recent times, that it's whatever soundbite that is most popular out there that the population then digests as truth, as opposed to understanding that the constitution really defines how important decisions are made in this country, how we select a police commissioner, how we select a prime minister, how we make decisions that impact on our day-to-day lives, how we make decisions that impact on our governance arrangements. But the average citizen is unaware of that. So it is very easy for politicians to talk about constitutional reform because it will appeal to some segments of the population. Okay, all right, we're going to do that. But when you actually have the opportunity to do that, you realize that the majority of the population doesn't care. So why waste time on rocking the boat and making changes that really, don't impact on the average citizen?
So the rhetoric sounds important, but which Caribbean politician really wants a stipulation that we will only have 2 terms in government?
Absolutely.
So it sounds good. It's like promising water for all.
Absolutely. And not understanding that water for all will come at a cost to the government and probably at a cost to the consumers, because the example of water for all is a good one, and I don't want to get into that space per se, but really and truly, infrastructure. One of the challenges that we have in our country is age infrastructure. To repair the age infrastructure, to be able to provide water to a lot of people requires injections of money, which may require government injections, but may also require people to pay for water so that, we can earn the revenues to maintain plant and equipment and pipelines, etc. So I think we live in an age where, we live in a populist age. So what appeals to the population is what our politicians use as fodder to get them elected into offices, so to speak. And you give people slogans and, one-liners, etc., because we know that the population is happy if you can connect to them and give them something that they can hold on to. But when you get into office, and the reality of management and governance, good governance and economic management and austerity, sometimes that is required, may not be popular with the population. So there is often, I was told by a politician once that I had made a proposal. He had asked for some good ideas, some new ideas. A former Minister of Finance, he had asked for some novel ideas. And I remember I went and I spoke about rolling back the fuel subsidy. This is long before it was even a thought. And because I was looking at the amount of money that was being spent on the fuel subsidy, and I realized it was not sustainable. And the minister then, it was a Saturday morning, and he had invited some people to come in and, share new ideas because, trying to deal with economic management. And I had done my spiel and everything. And he said, that was an excellent presentation. It was good economics, but bad politics. Next. Because really, he knew that he couldn't go to the population and, would not go down well with the population.
But if X, Y, and Z appeals to the population and you're there to serve what the population needs, what the population wants, isn't that what the democracy is all about?
But sometimes what the population wants may not be what the population needs. And that's where good governance comes into play. And governments sometimes have to make decisions that are economically wise, but are socially unpopular. And I think that is where the challenge arises in our system. So yes, we live in a democratic society, but I think very often the democracy is assumed that what the people want, the people will get. And sometimes that is not, a government can't afford to do that. So Trinidad and Tobago, because of how our economy is structured, which is why I often speak about structural transformation. Our economy is heavily skewed towards the energy sector. So gas now, and even the utterances of the former government and several governments, successive governments, have been around the energy sector, oil, gas, petrochemicals, as it were. But the change, we require a type of governance that recognizes that the energy sector is not sustainable. So we spoke earlier on about agriculture, about tourism, about diversifying the economy. But we have always had the challenge that we had sufficient money to buy our way out of situations. So we had enough money in the country to buy all of the food that we needed to import. So agriculture was not the focus of attention. The fact is that that situation has changed. Our fortunes have changed. And we now have to have serious, to my mind, we need to have serious conversations around that economic transformation, that structural transformation, which includes the transformation of our people in terms of how we see Trinidad and Tobago and how we understand the economy and how we understand what is happening globally and how it is impacting on our economic space. So the structural transformation really is multifaceted and has to be led by a government willing to make decisions that may be unpopular at times.
Basdeo Panday went on to serve 2 more terms as leader of the opposition before bowing out of electoral politics.
First of all, I said, if you are going to represent people, if you're going to be prime minister or minister and so on, you must be prepared to genuinely represent people. As I got older, I realized I was losing the strength that was necessary to properly serve people. As an electoral person, as a minister, prime minister, whatever, even parliamentarian. And therefore I decided that I will opt out of electoral politics. But politics has been my life. And I've always argued that there's more than one dimension to politics. It's not only electoral. Politics doesn't only mean going up for elections. And so politics for me has always been an activity that meant making other people happy, which is the purpose of life.
Some say that this people-centered narrative of the People's Partnership was more cosmetic than it was real.
I disagree. I would say it was populist because if you recall the People's Partnership in 2010, what brought them into office was their decision to axe the tax, the property tax, which resonated with the population because remember I said that Prime Minister Manning had started to take greater interest in shaping tax reform and revenue reform in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the conversations then was, of course, the introduction of the property tax. And 2010, the People's Partnership capitalized on the disquiet that was growing in the population and said, if we come in, if you vote for us, we will axe the tax. There was no conversation about how that revenue would be realized if you axe the tax. But the populists, so I think what we have seen growing is a kind of populist approach to governance. As opposed to what I described as kind of tempered democracy and responsible democracy, which is where you, to my mind, and I'm not a politician, you try to marry what is in the best interest of the people and of the country with what the realities are, as opposed to simply trying to do what is popular and what resonates with the population.
And then they were followed by the new Rowley administration.
That's correct.
Rowley, who by the time he knew he was departing, felt comfortable enough to say, I would take the tough decisions, even if it meant losing the election.
And yeah, the rest is history. I think, seriously though, I think Prime Minister Rowley's tenure, 2015 to 2025, was challenging because when they assumed office in 2020, energy prices were depressed. So they met a significantly reduced coffer and significantly reduced revenue inflows. So they started off with a challenge. I forget what the number was, but their revenue shortfall was to the tune of $6, $7, $8 billion. So having come into office in 2015 with that kind of challenge where you didn't know where the revenue was going to come from, but you had some big ticket items that you had to address. So enter the conversation around Petrotrin, enter the conversation around the size of government subsidies, enter the conversation around reshaping and reimagining social programs such as things like CPEP and the URPs, etc. And having to manage your budget deficit, because the deficit, at the time the People's Partnership demitted office, the UNC-led People's Partnership demitted office, the budget deficit had grown significantly because they had engaged in mega projects, as I mentioned. So when Prime Minister Rowley assumed office, with the best of intentions, he wanted to reduce the budget deficit, but that would come with some pain to the population. So he always, some of the big decisions he took in terms of the mothballing of the Petrotrin plant, which is still a conversation. Even today, years later, it's still a conversation. The decisions that they took in terms of rolling back the fuel subsidy, which is still a pain point because it then impacts on the cost of living, etc. The decision to not open the children's hospital, which having invested several hundreds of millions of dollars to build the hospital, it was left primarily unused except for COVID-19, for some use during COVID-19. So it always is a balancing act. But I think one of the things that happened is that the population felt increasingly so that between 2010 and 2025, the government had become disconnected from the needs of the people, what the people needed and what the people wanted. So I think that is what would have led to the outcome of the general election in 2025, where we saw, a significant defeat by the PNM because the years of what the people felt was, disconnectedness. I don't want to say neglect. That then resulted in where we are today.
So on the 63rd anniversary of Trinidad and Tobago's independence, what is the state of the economy and what is the challenge for the future?
I'm reminded of the Calypso, 55 years have gone how you feel. So we can say 63 years have gone how we feel. Our economy is extremely fragile. We are still heavily dependent on the energy sector. There was a lot of talk around the Dragon gas deal being the fillip, the impetus, the boost that the country needed, the oxygen that will be breathed into our economy as of 2027. And we now know with the change in administration in the United States, the Dragon gas deal is off the table. So the fact that we've continued to be so heavily dependent on the energy sector and there have been declines in production and the energy sector is not, we have a mature sector in Trinidad and Tobago, and the fact that you couple that with the climate change impetus that calls for a reduction in the use of fossil fuels, which is what is the backbone of our energy sector. And you couple that with the fact that the United States now has an administration that is less focused on climate change and more focused on reigniting the United States energy sector. So they have now become a significant player in natural gas, which means that Trinidad and Tobago's natural gas is not as widely demanded. So all of these knitted together present a very challenging economic forecast for Trinidad and Tobago. So different decisions have to be made. I again call for us to structurally transform our economy now that we no longer have the luxury of having all of the money that we want to import, all of the things that we want to import. Now is the time for us to focus very specifically and a targeted focus on the agriculture sector, because there is, shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. So the crisis in the energy sector and the goings on that can negatively impact our energy sector should force us to rethink our priorities. So the agriculture sector is something that for years our farmers have been begging, and those who are heavily invested in the agriculture sector, let us focus on one or two things that can help us kind of rebuild our sector, that can also bring in some income. It's not going to fill the void that the energy sector has left, given the shortfall in revenues from the energy sector, but it can help us swing the pendulum in terms of how we think about our economic space. There are also other sectors out there, the creative economies that we always talk about, and we think the creative economy is simply about carnival. It's not just about carnival. It's all of those other things, food and beverage festivals that we can have, that we can actually monetize. We can actually organize and monetize, and they will not fill the energy basket immediately, but they can help us engage in that transformation of the mind that moves us away from thinking only about energy and Trinidad and Tobago as synonymous terms, and help us understand that Trinidad and Tobago, there are untapped resources in terms of our creatives, in terms of our agriculture sector. Let's look at things differently, because now is the time for us to embrace the challenges and see what opportunities can emerge from them.
Dr. Marlene Attzs, thank you very much for sharing your insight.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this.
Introducing the new look of inspiration. Say hello to the all-new Ibis Baker's flour, specially crafted for your finest creations and home baking moments. Now alongside your trusted Ibis all-purpose flour, both with a fresh new look. Plus, we're excited to introduce a brand new 5 kilogram size, more of the quality you love. Whether you're kneading, mixing, or creating, do it with a brand that brings tradition to your table. Ibis, a tradition of excellence.
At Extra Foods, we care for you. That's why we always have the widest variety, the best prices, spacious aisles of total convenience, plus clean, safe surroundings. Let us care for you. Extra Foods, always extra for less.
In our next episode, we explore the 21st century, a time of rapid globalization, technological change, and political evolution. I'm Dominic Kalipersad. Thank you for watching The Leaders Who Built Our Nation.